Hello, welcome to Sociology of Crime, Week 3, Lecture 3. My name is William Wood. This week we've already looked at theory formulation in the first lecture. Second lecture we looked at classical criminology, its development, some of its assumptions, and criticisms. This last lecture we're going to take our discussion of deterrence theory from classical criminology and use that as an opportunity to expand into some of the other competing or overlapping social theories or social logics of punishment. So all societies punish. Throughout recorded history, every society has had mechanisms by which it deals with lawbreakers or people that violate social norms. What differs are the material and ideological conditions under which punishment is enacted. So in much of the pre-modern European societies in particular, we would see heavy emphasis on physical punishments. We've talked about this in relation prior to the view of punishment as a response to sin or other types of transgressions, focus on saving the soul at the expense of the body. In the modern world, we see focus away from physical punishments in most countries, maybe not so much my own, but and a focus towards deprivation of liberty or property. There's a very Durkheimian argument here that we'll come back to when we look at Durkheim in terms of social structural theories. Durkheim makes the argument that as societies become more complex, they're more likely to use retributive forms of punishment, less likely to use, more likely to use restitutive forms of punishment, seeking to restore social order, less likely to use retributive forms of punishment. Societies become more complex. So we have competing theories or approaches to understanding why societies punish the way that they punish. But before we look at those throughout the term, it's important to understand the basic social logics of punishment. That is, the reasons given by society or the reasons understood within any given society, why it's appropriate to inflict pain or to deprive liberty or to take away property or any other forms of punishment, how these are justified in different times and different places. Okay? So the ultimate punishment, as I said, even though Western society in general has tended to shift towards more restorative approaches to punishment, the United States remains one of the few Western countries, in fact the only Western industrialized country now, to retain the use of capital punishment. So Western legal systems historically predicated on 4 functions or logics of punishment: retribution, incapacitation, deterrence, rehabilitation. Retribution is by far the oldest form of punishment, at least what we have in terms of written history. Societies are mostly tribal or clan-based. So here we're looking at the Mosaic codes, for example. This is very old history, going 2,000 plus BCE. So society is mostly tribal or clan-based. Most dominant forms of punishment took the form of personal or family retribution. This is rooted in the ancient concept of an eye for an eye, where punishment is localized, often highly personalized. People who administer the punishment, either a victim of a family member or part of the victim's family or wider group, kinship group. Punishment is usually reflected, whatever the crime was, and so a lot of these codes, Hammurabi's codes, the Mosaic codes, are setting forth what the punishment is in response to a particular offense. Vengeance for the crime is mostly in the hands of the victim or family of the victim, personally exacted vengeance for the wrong or harm suffered. Examples of this, as I mentioned, the Hammurabi, different codes found throughout Babylon, the Mosaic codes in what is now referred to as Hebrew Bible or Old Testament by Christians. Again, as old or older than, we're 4,000 plus years. So this term retributive, in a sense, this is from the OED, I've put up here, you can somewhat follow one of the nice things about the Oxford English Dictionary is unlike any other dictionaries, it is a definitive dictionary in the English language that provides an etymological history. So you can look at the earliest known use in the English language and any significant ways that it changes over time. So we can look at how this term retributive has changed somewhat, but by and large, retributive justice refers to designating a form or concept of justice that punishes or rewards a person in accordance with and proportion to their conduct. Also in later use, designing a system of justice based on punishment of the offender rather than on rehabilitation. So purely retributive approaches, approaches founded purely on this concept of an eye for an eye, view the restoring of social equity as the only justification for punishment. Okay? Out of the 4 social logics of punishment, it's the only one that in its purest form is backwards looking. It says society does not have the right to deprive you of liberty to deter something you might do in the future. It doesn't have the right to deprive you of liberty in order to achieve some other social good of encouraging the person next to you not commit a crime. It doesn't have the right to deprive you of liberty to try and fix you to be a better person tomorrow. It only has the right to deprive you of your liberty in response to a harm or crime that you have done to somebody else that upsets the scales of social equity. So writing these scales, the term that is often used to describe this is just deserts. Retributive approaches are often described today as just deserts, as in one getting their just deserts for putting these scales, this balance of justice out of whack, and the need to weigh down in terms of deprivation of liberty, deprivation of property, etc., the scale so that balance is restored. So it's the only backwards thinking. The other 3 that we'll look at, deterrence, retribution, and incapacitation, all take the form of justifying deprivation of punishment, deprivation of liberty or property, in terms of attempting to alter future outcomes. So purely retributive approaches view restoring of social equity as the only justification for punishment, but punishments have also been used for millennia as means of social control. So we can go all the way back to when the Romans occupied, when they occupied Gaul, when they occupied Palestine, the crucifixion itself is a very brutal form of deterrence. Putting people up, torturing them in effect as a sign to, in this case, to Jews and to Israelites who were questioning the power of Rome, refusing to recognize Roman authority. So even though retribution is the oldest codified, we can go back to ancient history very easily and find examples of punishment, brutal forms of punishment being used as a mechanism to generally deter, and this term general deterrent then is a focus on punishment to deter the general public from specific social actions or even ideologies. Strategies hold that rates of crime and deviance are influenced and controlled by threat of punishment. So this is clearly in line with what we looked at last lecture in relation to classical criminology. The assumption here is if you can get the amount of threat of punishment right, you'll get enough people who follow the law in order to maintain social stability, to deter people from committing would-be criminal acts, etc. So again, Middle Ages, this deterrence tended to be manifest in the physicality of punishments. Specific deterrence refers, on the other hand, not to an attempt to get the general public to generally follow the rules, but the use of punishment as an applied response to somebody who has committed an offense to get them to not offend again. All right? So specific deterrence, then sanctions should be so powerful that known criminals will not repeat their criminal actions. Is aimed at people who have already committed an offense, not the general public. So a good example of specific deterrence is the use of 3 strikes, which is most prevalent, or historically most prevalent in the United States, but also there's a version of it in New Zealand, and it's even been trialed in Australia. Right, this is the application of punishment where, as a first-time offender, you're given X amount of punishment. The assumption is that punishment will make you go away, you won't offend again. If you do offend again, the state then gives you more punishment, Y amount of punishment, on the assumption that the application of punishment the first time wasn't enough to specifically deter you. A third time, you're given even more punishment. State of California, 25 years to life. The assumption that you're not likely to be deterred, but probably represent a habitual or career criminal, where the threat of reoffending is so high that the state justifies the application of a greater amount of punishment, not only for deterrence, but for another social logic of punishment, incapacitation. Right? So finishing on deterrence theory then, as we mentioned in the last lecture, emerging out of the work of Cesar Beccaria and also Jeremy Bentham, often thought of as an economic model of social control, assumes rational actors seek to maximize pleasure, minimize pain. And central to the philosophies, as we mentioned in the last lecture, of utilitarianism as well as contemporary rational choice approaches to crime. So this example of 3 strikes, where the third strike really being an application of a huge amount of punishment in the state of California, for example, 25 to life, invokes this third use of punishment, which is incapacitation, which involves the revoking of an individual's ability to participate in criminal or other deviant behavior. So the British used colonies, for example, as forms of banishment, as well as means by which to rid the homeland of criminal felons, various rogues, vagabonds, and beggars. So the foundation of early American, Australian colonies as penal colonies is a quite well-known historical example of incapacitation. Incapacitation today is often cited in terms of the increase in prison populations, which we've mentioned in previous lectures. The United States has seen over 5-fold increase in 40 years. Australia has seen a 140% increase, as you'll see in one of your research essay questions for sociology of crime. So the final social logic and punishment that we'll talk about is rehabilitation. Rehabilitation emerges in the middle or end of the 19th century in relationship to the rise of a number of social reform movements, particularly social reform movements around young people, around juveniles. So the first juvenile court in the Western world is Cook County, Illinois in 1899, where it's recognized in some sense that youth don't have the same capacity to either appreciate the consequences of their actions or to respond to punishment the same way that adults do. But a larger rehabilitative approach emerges where crime, deviant behavior is assumed, at least in part, to be both a product of deficient internal or external mechanisms, so physiology, psychology, or social environment, and also, in some cases, to be able to be rectified, right? And the social logic here shifts away from the application of punishment as an eye for an eye or an application that assumes a rational mind towards an application of punishment that attempts, in some sense, to change or to fix or to transform the offender. The earliest of these are in the reform houses, become the first modern prisons. We see these in the United States and the UK as early as the late 17th and beginning of the 1800s. This is where we get the word penitentiary, right, out of this concept of penitence. The Auburn model is an example of one of these early prisons. We have here a little bit of writing about what this model entailed. Boston clergyman who visited it, the Auburn model, The Auburn prison in 1826 founded a shining example of what could be accomplished with proper discipline and design. The whole establishment, from the gate to the sewer, is a specimen of neatness, he wrote. The unremitted industry, the entire subordination and subdued feeling of the convicts have probably no parallel among an equal number of criminals. The Reverend Lewis Dwight and his associates from Boston Prison Discipline Society pronounced Auburn a noble institution and said, "We regard it as a model worthy of the world's imitation." The institution seemed so successful that in 1825, Linz was assigned to build a similar prison in Sing Sing. That prison still exists today. So, out of this early model comes a view of punishment as rehabilitation, and that the function of punishment begins to focus on either internally, the transformation of the individual internally, or the transformation in the society or culture or environment from which he or she developed bad habits or bad learning, etc. Obviously, these different social logics of punishment are at the core of many of the social theories of crime, the sociological theories of crime that we'll look at throughout the rest of the term. But that concludes our lecture for this week. I hope you all have a nice week, and I look forward to speaking to you next week.